same time.
Speaking of which, I started the recording.
Sorry,
Hey,
I've never logged into HackMD before, so I don't know how to take notes. Do I use SSO or what?
No, you just create yourself an account, personal account. Anyone's allowed to edit it. It's got history. That's why. So
all right. For those folks that are here, go ahead and drop your names into the attendance. We have a list, got a list of RFCs, all sorts of things going on. Match param selector. Last time we put that into our 1 week final review, and now that has passed.
what?
So I'm going to declare match params review as accepted. And we'll see next gen Carta some of our new efforts to simplify what's going on there. Essentially, match param selector is there to make it more straightforward for authors of a platform that's writing sort of the default choices. Right now, it's possible for them to have no idea what the app operators will choose as the values, and so we've ended up with more logic in the templates handling the different choices that would be made than is ideal. So this will allow the operators to set some parameter choices, and for the authors of that platform to say, hey, if they chose parameter 1, use this template. And if they chose parameter 2, use that template. So there's the quick overview. And of course, this was discussed more in depth like 2 or 3 weeks ago. Next, artifact tracing. I believe I saw approvals from Todd last week. So, pulling that. Yeah. I see on at least one approvals from both Rash and Todd. Thank you. Big thank you to both of them. Scott, I know that you and I and Steven have talked about artifact tracing. There was one change that had been requested, just not caching unnecessary values. So I took that out of the relevant RFC, the correlation rules. Otherwise, if we appreciate the time from our TOC. Is that right? For a TOC to check these out and either point out the glaring faults or approve. And then,
yeah, it's definitely been a while since I've looked at these three. I will give them another read.
Thanks, Scott. Because it might be only you who's available to do the approval that we require. Because I don't think James or Stephen have bandwidth for it. I'm not suggesting you do, but I think they have even less, maybe.
They are certainly responsible for more.
I looked at the attendance list and I was like, Rash, is that your actual middle name? And then I was like, wait, that's not exactly your last name. So
that's Simpsons. I'm sorry, I was being silly. Sometimes when I write my own name, I get tired of how long it is, and I get
fair enough. It is your name. You get to do with it as you wish. And then the big item today is general use cartographer. So we've been using the almost codename blueprints for lots of different functionalities that we have hypothesized would make cartographer easier for operators or platform authors, or would make it more a more general use tool. In this doc, which is in the hack notes, I've just been working on writing up RFCs for all the different pieces of all those different ideas, and really trying to separate each idea from the other so that we can take a hard look at each idea and see if it's something we want to take on. One of my goals, and I think it's the most controversial thing, is I would like to delay as long as possible the change to a new CRD. At a conversation last week with Scott, and one of the things that he said was, that changing the CRD is kind of like our ace in the hole. Like we can play it once and just say like, okay, we're changing everything. And as such, I would love to keep our trump cards as long as possible. And so the approach they've taken here is that we, all of these features, working through how can we leave supply chains, how can we allow supply chains that exist today to continue to work and add functionality so that we could write new supply chains in the new way, and have those work as well. And in that way, enable there to be this period where we are able to write the documentation and do the marketing outreach at conferences, conference talks, etc., to educate, like, oh, here are new ways that you can use Cartographer, so that people get used to the new functionality. They start experimenting with it. TAP is built on top of it, and then later, when we have a breaking change, or when we decide, okay, now we want to get rid of the old methods, then we say, okay, we're going to create this new CRD, blueprints, and blueprints is only going to have the new stuff. It won't have the old stuff. I'm going to pause there because, like I said, I think that that's kind of the most high-level decision that, or a big high-level decision to discuss.
Yeah, so I think I definitely agree that there's a lot here, and it's good to see it really broken down into incremental, digestible pieces. At the same time, I think it's really valuable to know, like, big picture, where do we want to get to? Like, what is our end goal? And then we can back off from that and think, okay, well, how do we want to get there? And typically when you're doing like an API refactor, there's two different paths. One is that you start building up the new API incrementally, and you kind of bring over people as the new API supports the features, so there's enough of them. that like it satisfies those user requirements that they can actually use a new API successfully. Sort of the other way of approaching it is to bring up the new API wholly independently and just say like, there is no migration path. It is a new thing. And like you can use it independently. The old one still works. You can migrate whenever it's convenient to you as a user to migrate. So kind of the first path, you can typically get people onto the new API faster, but it can take longer to actually complete that transition. It's like to build up the new API so that actually supports everything. To get to like, sorry, it takes longer to get to where it's actually considered like complete in terms of what the vision was, because you're constantly trying to make sure that it's compatible and people can come over to it. Versus on the build up the whole new API independently, it can take longer to actually get all of your users over, because like they can still use the existing one. Like there's no direct migration path. So like the migration takes more effort. So it kind of depends on, like, again, these are like polar extremes, and there's definitely like a middle where like we can kind of do a little bit of both. But it's worth thinking through. So sort of like, if you had to bias one way or the other, which way would you bias? And Rash, I see your hands up.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I've lost power, so I'm on my phone. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yep, okay. So definitely looking at this, it really depends on what our final design is as well, what our final goal is. I don't want to go into the details, but I am pushing for a much more statically analyzable supply chain and components. And if that is where we end up, then there will be some horrible migrations if we did things incrementally on the new API into the new API. Just because, yeah, it would be really, really hard. Not migrations, conversions. If we were to start a new API and then incrementally introduce certain things like type safety for inputs, making that required would be something that's difficult to do after the fact. If there is not too much pressure, my feeling is that we try to do the whole new API, making sure that we implement the things that are most breaking first, so that we don't waste a lot of the team's time doing conversion webhooks and some of the harder things when it comes to migration. That's my 2 cents, but that's my experience from looking at it. I've tried to build up something of an API. I've mocked out some of it, and in doing so, I was just thinking, I'd rather just implement some of these things. And just as an extra bonus, is we have most of the code we need to do it anyway there in our library for Cartographer. It's not like we'd be starting from scratch. It would be like we were implementing certain behaviors from scratch, but reusing things like the stamping, right, and context building. It's already the hardest part of the work, caching of existing state when we stamp, that sort of thing. It's just my 2 cents. It might not be the right way forward, but it feels more manageable that way, and also gives us opportunity to come up with a better API for genericism.
So I would say that the point when we would need conversion webhooks is when we say, okay, we're going to start deprecating fields, and saying like this is, or when we take an optional field and we say this optional field is now required, or we take a field that's available.
Which is not a deprecation.
Yeah,
making it required, or introducing fields that are required for the first time. They weren't even optional. They weren't there.
Yeah. So far, every RFC that I've written up as if we are making one of one change and then sometimes the second one, adding an optional field and then taking a required field and making it optional. And then, as I said, and in terms of the conversion webhook thing, I agree with you. Once we are satisfied and we say like, hey, look at this, like people are using it, it's useful. We no longer need that old behavior. When we go to deprecate, that's when I'm like totally on board for the write a new API. And at that point, my hope is it's the same object, supply chain. We just make a new CRD called blueprints, and blueprints need have no new features at that point. We can just say like, hey, like you can just go from here to there. But blueprints is not going to support like this other stuff that we're now deprecating, and it's going to have some of the stuff that's now optional. It's now going to be required. So it's not clear to me that we'll have the time to come to a decision on that. So rather than do that, I would like to run through some of what's in here, unless there are any objections.
I
Scott.
definitely want to hear Scott. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that I understand from the user perspective, right? Because I'm not coming from the engineering perspective, I'm coming from the user of Cartographer. I think that, someone that's going to write cluster supply chains, cluster templates, whatever it is, if we start to add in a lot of fields, and now there's two ways of using the same CRD, which is already very flexible in how to use it, I worry how difficult it will be for someone to start creating a supply chain in the correct way and not use half of the new method, half of the old method, until we're ready to migrate over to the blueprint architecture. Because I think you're going to end up with a lot of weird permutations in the middle from people that are just going to be using kubectl explain to understand how the CRD looks, and they're going to do something in the old way, something in the new way, and it's going to have some ugly breakage, which is something that I would worry about from the consuming perspective in this middle term period, which makes it less possible or less optimal to also get the feedback on how the new method works from end users.
Scott?
Yeah, so I definitely hear that and I agree with the concern. To a certain extent, it depends on what the change is. So like if there's a new optional feature that like is part of the blueprints model today, which I'm sure we're going to talk about in a moment, that then we're sort of retrofitting on top of the existing API, then I think like that's net new functionality. Like as long as it's not required, like it's something that users can choose to use and get the benefits from if they use it. And if they choose not to use it, then they don't get those benefits and they just get the existing behavior. So again, like it depends on like what the specific change is, but like I wouldn't imagine we basically say supply chain spec is like option A or option B, and like you have to wholesale switch over. That would just be screaming to just like it's a different resource, just go create a different API. So like at that point, like even if it had the same API version kind, like if like the internal structure is so different that it's a different resource, we might as well just create a different resource.
Yeah,
That's a great
I was just
transition.
gonna point out
Mhm.
thing. So yeah, another cool thing about having a different resource or us using a different group is that then we're also very free to experiment and get things wrong and like not have to worry too much about it, while at the same time integrating fast and like being able to roll it out, to other folks to try it out as well. I think that can be a benefit in terms of speed as well. Meanwhile, we could essentially maintain what we have as like sure it's out there, it's kind of deprecated-ish. We're not adding new functionality or fixing bugs, but like leave it at that while having the ability to experiment with like a new controller or the new CRs. Maybe that can be also something to consider, like our speed of trying things out, getting things wrong, and rolling back with not having to worry too much about it.
So I actually, it's not clear to me that that's the case. I think that the way I started this out was that idea that a project can have a limited number of semver majors before people start looking at it side eye and being like, what is going on with this thing? It's not stable, which I think makes the switch over to blueprints more high risk. That if we tell people, oh, go to this new CRD, it works different. You've got to adopt all the changes wholesale. If we get it wrong, that's a more dangerous way to get things wrong than if we say you can, if you need like just this one little piece of functionality, like we've put that into supply chains, and like there's some other stuff that some other people are going to be concerned about, and like down the road you'll need to adopt it at some point, but for right now you can just do your thing. That seems more possible with the just change supply chains to me. Okay. So let's talk about what some of these changes are. Are you guys looking? I think you're seeing my screen. I don't see the big green box. Am I showing
Yeah, we're
this
seeing
general
it.
use?
You're showing
We
your
can
whole
see it.
screen.
Awesome. So yeah, there are a lot of ideas here. Some of them are bigger changes than others. Some of them sort of tie together thematically, and some don't necessarily. So I'll just kind of talk about each one, and maybe there should be a conversation at some point, like, okay, which goals are we trying to hit? This first one, allowing workload to supply chain pairing to be done by a separate selector object. So there's the idea that you would, in the supply chain today, you write a selector into the supply chain that is required, and this would make that optional and would allow you, if you use that option to not include it, you would create a new object, cluster blueprint selector. You would specify what's the what is the supply chain that it's pairing with, and what's the owner. At some point, I'm going to broadcast. At some point, I'm going to write an RFC that we stop referring to owner and start referring to origin, so that we can disambiguate those terms. I know I had a conversation with somebody last week where I threw around owner in the Cartographer, the way Cartographer uses it, to mean workload or deliverable, and immediately we had to have a 5-minute conversation like, wait, are we talking about that idea, or are we talking about the way Kubernetes uses owner? And so just disambiguating our terms, not overloading names, would be helpful. But anyways, we specify, okay, what's the origin, what's the owner, and we specify that here. I saw Rash pointing out that this type, maybe we can achieve that just by using match fields, which I think is sounds totally doable. I haven't tried
You need to
writing that up.
be
Yeah.
you need to be clear about what the API version kind to actually be watching for. So doing it as a field selector is a little hard because you don't know what resource to even look at the fields of.
Mhm.
I mean, like technically you could express it as a field selector, but you'd have to make sure that those two fields are always defined in the field selector.
Mhm.
So it's just because it's special and because it's fit for purpose, it's worth calling it out separately in my mind.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Yeah, so that's this one at a high level. My goal is to kind of touch all these really quickly so that we have a sense of the scope of the different changes. So unless there are objections, I'm going to jump to the next one. Right now, there are only 3 kinds of templates that emit outputs, and all those outputs are meant to be typed. It is possible to pass arbitrary information in them, but that's not something that we should promote. And we've already come up with some examples of, just in conversations, of different types of information that users want to pass, even in our domain of CI/CD. So this proposal is, right now there's that 4th template type, cluster template, which doesn't emit any output. And this RFC says, let's allow it to emit arbitrary output. In the same way that we add to it the outputs field that you would find on a runnable, where you're able to specify what fields should, at what field should you find a value that you will make available to the supply chain with this given name. And then we can see the supply chain can then say, hey, this cluster template, I want to pass a value in from it. You refer to the resource the same, the name is the same. The supply chain specifies for the receiving template what's the name that it's going to make a value available at, and then it would go, and then it would say what was the name of the field that it's passing on. So here it's saying, hey, I want to pass on the init field. And so this is the one new field from the supply chain's standpoint. This obviously is an untyped approach. I am fairly certain that we can after the fact go back and add in typing the type that we saw in Stephen's gist, in large part because we see that same idea that you would have some list of outputs exists, and then there's a reference to some third object that defines an output type, and if you include that, then you get better behavior. I write about that in alternatives. Yeah, and I would just write, if we were saying like, yes, we definitely want to do that, I would write that up as an additional RFC to say like, this is behavior that you can leverage at choice.
One question.
I'll pause there. Yeah.
So you showed in the supply chain like how you have like the inputs field to consume it. How does it look in the template then? Oh, I see. Inputs dot. Hey, I see.
Yeah, that's a good call out. There's a new, originally there was only images or sources or config, and now there's this, or params, and now there's this field inputs. I will, later down, there's another proposal that shows how we could actually achieve this as, we could use language to change this, instead of saying inputs, we could turn it into params and pass this as a param. And we'll get there in a bit.
So just one more
any-
question.
Mhm.
Oh, so like now we have an introduction of inputs. I'm looking at the cluster supply chain. What about the other fields like sources, images, configs? In this proposal, would we keep them or no? Like everything would come under inputs.
Keep them. Again, everything that I've written up is with the
Small migration.
if you are doing things the way you are today, Cartographer would still work with it.
Got it. Cool. Thanks, Scott.
Would inputs work here for images though?
So one thing that you can see is, oh no, I guess it wasn't in this example. You could take any cluster image template, any of our typed templates, and you could write it then as a cluster template. And then you could just point your outputs and say, image is some field on this object that I've templated out. And so you would be able to change any of the current objects into this arbitrary output template.
Okay, and a cluster template without outputs would have the same behavior as a cluster template today, basically just stamp and forget it and move on to the next resource.
That's correct, yeah.
Okay. Cool.
Scott A.
Can we make this doc public?
Yes.
Awesome. Thanks, Scott. Thanks, Oshila.
Yeah. All right. Next, composition of supply chains. We've been talking about it for quite a while. We want to be able to move from, hey, here's your basic supply chain, to here's your composed supply chain. I will say that there's additional. Yeah, this essentially breaks down into two RFCs, because when I wrote the first one, I was only considering the challenge of this model, where you have a supply chain at the beginning of the composing supply chain. So the only challenge is, how do I read values out of the supply chain into templates later on? There's a different question. What if there's something that this composed supply chain, what if there's work that it did before and this inner supply chain needs to consume it? And so there are two different RFCs that handle this. One is, this case, the read from an inner supply chain states that you would be able to, we would add to the cluster supply chain an outputs field. That outputs field would have the same shape as this, we were just looking at this inputs field where we saw like, oh, refer to a particular resource, refer to the particular output of that resource and give it a name. We would do the same thing here for when we wanted to have an output of a supply chain. We would refer to some particular resource. We would refer to what's the name of the field of it, and what name will we expose to the outer supply chain. And then, so one thing that this relies upon is that in this case, you would need to use a cluster template, because of this this syntax is relying on this being a cluster template rather than a cluster image template. Then the outer supply chain consumes in the same. You can see the similarities in this. It consumes the same untyped values that are being passed along, and that should be sufficient to allow a supply chain to pass values from, for an outer supply chain to consume values from an inner supply chain. Questions or thoughts? Okay.
It really makes me want a different resource.
Fair enough. The other case where we want to pass values in, this is that we would then. Scott pointed out that there's already a resource or there's already a concept where we do that, where we say like, oh, you can define this at multiple levels, and that's params. You can define params in the template, and it can be overridden by the supply chain. That can be overridden by the workload, and so if we introduce this idea of nesting supply chains, then we could just say like, oh, like here's the param. You can define it in the outer, or here's the template, define it in the template. You can define it in the inner supply chain. You can define it in the outer supply chain. You can define it in the workload. And so here we introduce a new field. Normally in params, what you get is a name, and you get either a value or a default, and you can only write out a static value. And here what we're saying is, instead of writing out a static value, you should be able to write out a reference to a field in the workload, or a reference to a value coming from another resource. And so here we see a reference to the owner, and I think I was pretty sure that yeah, and then here we see a reference to here we see a reference to not a value from the workload, but a value from another template.
I wonder if by doing like in your blueprint, you providing a pointer to the owner, that's like too much of a coupling between the blueprint and whichever owners you get, because like if the cluster blueprint selector is how we tie like a given blueprint to a particular owner. Yeah, I wonder if that's the place where you wanted to make this mapping between something that comes from the owner to something that goes down to the blueprint. Like if we were to think of the blueprint taking that as a param, do you think that's something that could be doable, where like in the selector you say specta git URL is turns out to be the value for this param, and you do that at the blueprint selector? If that's a way that we can keep this independence between the blueprint and the owner. Have you thought about that? Like, does it make sense even, the question?
I've thought about it because Rash had mentioned it. So
yes, this morning. Yeah.
I haven't written that up, but it's one of these that isn't blue yet. Where is it?
one before the last one. Allow any states.
No, this is different. Do I not have one for this?
Oh, before that, sorry. Like operators can provide params in selector.
Oh, yes. Yes, exactly. Thank you. Good job of reading. So yeah, I think it would that would be a fine place, and we could say like, yeah, it makes the most sense to do that there. I would imagine that we would
And it's tricky
Yeah,
because I
I
also
wouldn't-
imagine you, if you want to do any form of conditionals, that you would probably, let's say, use YTT4. Like, oh, that gets tricky too. In the selector. I mean.
You just have multiple
Yeah.
params,
True.
especially now that there's a param selector.
well, I missed
Yeah,
that second part.
That's right.
Especially now that there's a param selector. There, obviously, that was
right.
approved this week.
Yeah.
So what I like about the idea of pushing more of this upstream to where there's more knowledge of the specific origin resource is that today we have all that knowledge baked into the individual templates. And like that is very deep knowledge, a couple layers abstracted. Like that feels like it's a lot of like deep knowledge leaking through as opposed to being funneled through sort of in an intended way. So like we have templates today within or internally that like in theory are generic, but also are very specific to workload. And the other issue we have there is like, even if you imagine workload versus deliverable, and like, okay, these are two different resources, but also if we ever want to have workload V2, like we have to have some way of having the templates understand, okay, well, what version of the workload resource am I actually templating against? And it basically means like, even if we have conversion webhooks on the workload resource, like we can never actually fully like evolve a field on the workload today, just because its consumption is so far baked down the pipe and we have no idea how it's actually read and consumed.
Yeah, I think something Raj has been talking about is the idea of not giving any access in the templates to the owner, right? So that you're forced to really deal with everything as either params or inputs, whichever way we end up doing it.
That's the
Yeah.
kind of breaking change I would love to make, but there's also a massive breaking change. So structuring that, like you could have a template opt out of having access to the origin, but like doing that across the board isn't something we can force right now without going the full new API group route. Or maybe we say, like, if you're doing a cluster template and you're defining outputs, then you can't reference the origin. Like you could find some way of like adding features in lockstep, but that also starts to get to Scott's earlier concerns about like, are we kind of creating a lumpy API as opposed to just creating a new clean API? So these are all just, there's no right answer. These are all just trade-offs.
Mm-hmm. So it is here. I was going to say that I earlier was highlighting like, oh, here's how you would consume the output of another field, but I was pointing to something related, but wasn't discussing. But yeah, I showed you can have reference, and then under reference dot origin. But here you have reference dot resource, and you would provide the name of the cluster template and the name of the output field of the cluster template, and then that would become that a valuable value. So here's that change that I was hinting at, where in the example above, I had inputs dot a valuable value, and now we've got params.aValuableValue. So we could decide, if we're going to adopt both of these, maybe we don't need to have that top level or that supply chain resources inputs field. Like we'll just say like, no, if you want to do that, just use params. I would say that cuts against typed inputs, in my opinion. But we can see. Next idea. We just talked about composition, constrain. So I took a first pass at what Rash and Scott have been talking about in terms of constraining templates in terms of the parameters and the inputs that they consume, where we would put on the templates, on all the templates, we'd put a new field, inputs, and users would specify, here are the inputs that I'm expecting to consume. The functionality that I wrote in the how it works was that these are just a filter. They represent a maximal set where when the behind the scenes Cartographer is supplying to every template some stamp context, and we would just say if the field is not listed in inputs, it'll just get stripped out. It won't be available to them. And in that way, we'll know that the template couldn't be consuming anything beyond what they declare here. The other thing that we see is right now you can specify params and you can specify default parameter value, and this would say you needn't always declare a default value, but you would have to say, like, here are all the parameter names that I'm expecting to leverage in the same way that you would for all of your other inputs. The additional behavior that we could layer on is we could say, oh, if you did not receive this value in your stamp context, then we should throw an error message and let folks know, like, hey, you declared that you wanted this, it's not being provided, or we that's totally a possibility. Or we could just do what we do today, which is we stamp out whatever we can, and if the API server accepts it, we're like, hey, that's great, the API server accepted this thing. Or if it doesn't, then we say, like, hey, you tried to stamp out something and it got rejected from the API server.
Yeah, so just looking at it, our feeling is, we'd really like not to do like workload dot anything. It's that idea of, oh, you take everything as params. I think it's really, really powerful, especially because then if you wanna, let's say, do the equivalent of, what if I were to execute this template? Well, you've got all the params. As long as you fill them, you get something out, right? Which is the whatever the template says. Which, I don't know, I feel like it's really, really, really powerful. And with something that references the owner, then it gets like less like a function that just has this very like tiny signature, which is something that then, depends on the owner. Very, very interesting.
So what I characterize this as, you're saying maybe we don't even need to do this one. We would just say, we would just do the params, and we would say, if you want this functionality, then you need to start passing everything as params using this other the other functionality proposed.
Just a raw thought, but that's what I was thinking. Yeah.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I'll say that this is definitely the clunkiest thing in there. I was like, what do you even declare that you're going to use?
Yeah. Oh, and if we were to do the like, oh, everything's parem, so perhaps something that's also powerful there is if we could have some way of you declaring a schema for anything that's like more complex than just like a plain string. That I think is also pretty powerful. Helps us
Or even if
validate
it is a
if the
string.
inputs are good. Yeah, even if it's a string, right? Then the schema is super small anyway. True. True.
Yeah. So the most useful part of declaring inputs, or sorry, using inputs generically, I do like the idea of like focusing everything on params and normalizing it that way. But like we've been having conversations about like people building other tools on top of Cartographer. And like one of the problems is like right now, templates don't communicate to supply chains, assuming a supply chain is consuming it, like what values it expects to exist. So it's hard to know like, oh, this template is actually compatible in this case or not, or it requires these things to be wired into it. Otherwise it'll blow up randomly at runtime. Or Sing is nice if it exists, but it's optional. Like you have no knowledge of that until you actually look at the source of the template.
And does this look sufficient, or my hope is that this addresses that case? And if you're looking at it, you're like, oh,
no, like I actually don't think that addresses it all. Like for example, I'll just take like from the example supply chain, going into a KPack imagery source. Like you need to consume source. Like logically, that's like it makes sense. Like the template needs to access the source in order to build something. But a generic supply chain tool has no way of knowing that. So it doesn't know that you need to give that resource in your supply chain a source output from another resource. So like that's the type of structured metadata that's missing today. Versus,
so this is where I would say like yeah, here we have that KPack image template. Is it that this needs to? So one request that I've seen from folks is to have a description field. I'm going to write up like allow parameters to have description fields. This should have a URL in
something
it.
human readable.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think the idea of having inputs name sources source, like it can kind of work, but it's inelegant because it requires that you have a knowledge of the templating structure, and then the tools have to have that knowledge in order to know what it is, as opposed to just saying, I need a value of this type. I don't care how you satisfy it. I need a value that is a string that is a URL that references a source blob. Like, because that's ultimately what you care about.
So one of the things I think is interesting in the here is I would say that right now we live in the typed world, that like a source we've already declared. What's a source? Well, it's meant to be it's meant to have two fields, one URL, one revision, and those are they're meant to be Git sources. Like in the same way that images, like the output when you say I'm going to consume an image, you know, it's going to provide one field, it's the image field, and that value is meant to be an image digest. And that right now, we don't do a lot of validation of that. They said a long ago, RFC said that we would, and we haven't yet implemented that. Yeah, you could be worried that like somebody's out there using these templates in a rogue manner, but I would argue that if you relax into the types that we have today, that's already what's provided, because there are no untyped outputs.
But I think, so if you think about it as a tool author perspective, so like input name sources dot source means something to you because you understand the templating context within that template. But like it could also be sources 0 source, or sources find the source named something dot source, depending on how the inputs are fired in. So like this is a syntactic sugar expression on top of the raw under the hood structure that consumers at a layer above you might not be fully familiar with, as opposed to just saying, I need a param called source that has this shape. And then you don't care how the supply chain wires that value into you. You don't care whether it's coming from a param. You don't care whether it's coming from the output of another resource. All you care about in the template is that you're getting the value, the input that you care about. Sorry, shouldn't use input, overloaded, but you're getting the value that you care about.
So I guess one thing that I hear, so yeah, I think that there's an academic question of like whether this still works. I don't think that it does, but I definitely want to check out some cattle tests and see.
If it doesn't work, it was a breaking change that we made somewhere along the line accidentally.
I think it may have been before we released. But like I said, I'm happy to check. I'd say it shouldn't matter what it goes here so much as, hey, there's going to be some item in this grouping of sources. And I guess the one big advantage I hear from having that be an object on the cluster is you are totally correct that when I look at sources, I understand the typing that's sort of baked into Cartographer, and that's definitely not represented on any object on the cluster. It's not something that you can look up on cluster. You have to look it up in Carto documentation. Yeah, and
it's certainly better than the current state where you actually have to go introspect the contents of the template to figure that out. But I think we could take it a step further.
Okay. I'm trying to think through how.
Like if you had to choose sources as someone writing the template, you know exactly what you need from each one of them, right? So for instance, if you had, let's say, a source that is bringing you some source code and some other sources bring you some configuration, like in your template, you would probably refer to them as such, right? Like git clone source code, git clone source configuration. So if we were to only have params, like we would probably have a param for each as well, right? Which would be then have its own like schema that the controller would be able to first validate. So whoever is trying to tie this template to something else, right? Like the controller is able to tell that whether whatever gets passed through fits, because you know the schema and you know what's being outputted. And so like you can do that kind of matching. So yeah, I don't know, it feels like even for like this kind of case, if we're able to make use of unambiguous params that have the schema in them, seems like it solves this one as well. Kind of confusion you can make with sources or any kind of multiple inputs. Just some thoughts.
Yeah, and I think what I hear is
Or
So-
another
so-
example, one that's more like palpable, maybe it's you have a cluster image template that builds a container image, and you need a base builder image, and you need a runtime image. Let's say the base image being Golang Alpine, and then the runtime being, I don't know, Distroless or something. You know exactly, like whenever you refer to them, you know exactly which one you want, right? And so if those were to be params, you'd probably have two params. One that's maybe builder image, the other that's runtime image. And then the what's the name? The schema for them would be, yeah, the string and the string.
yeah,
So it's pretty
I believe-
unambiguous. If you were to think of it as a function, the function whose signature is string to string, right? Go ahead.
It's been a
Scott.
while since I've done this, but I believe you can, like when you pass in multiple sources, I believe like obviously there's this sugar to get the first one just implicitly, so you don't have to deal with the indexing. But then you can either index them by the ordinal, or sorry, by the index, or you can grab them by name by using just sort of like a JSON path sub
I
expression.
think only by name nowadays,
Um,
because it's a map, I think, under the hood.
I
I think, I'm not sure.
that's what I was saying. I don't
okay,
think the
I thought
ordinal
like we were
still works.
representing it as an array, but then we added the map syntax as like an extra layer of syntax sugar.
I see.
Now we're gonna have to go look at the source and figure out how it works.
Yeah, I was
But
just
if
going
we
to throw
don't
together
know,
a cuddle
then
test.
users are really gonna have fun.
Well, that is if we released with it. I'm pretty sure that before we released and before any documentation was written, that we pulled out the index pathing. But I think that aside, yeah, I guess this feels like a reason that we wouldn't want that. I guess when we're passing things, I think I heard. So, Sarah, correct me if I'm wrong. It sounded like you were saying, it would totally be possible to have some parameter that has name group of sources, and then we could choose to type it, and this would be a list of sources of length 2. Length 2. Each struct has a URL and a revision. And like we could force people to define that in code, and then we could consume it, and then it would be readable. And I think I was hearing you say, and I will say that if you didn't say this, I'm saying it because I think it would be a preferable experience. Instead of group of sources, you would just have source 1 URL, and then source 2 URL, and then source 1 revision.
Hopefully a more semantic name than source 1, but
yeah.
Or source 1 could then have a map of 2 fields.
Yeah, I was thinking like source source code, and then the type of that is the struct. Yeah, URL and revision. Then another parem would be the configuration source, let's say, and then the type would be pretty much the same, URL and revision.
So I would argue that if we want folks to, so one, we can get, I think we can go a super far distance just by giving people description fields. And I know on Friday there was a discussion in, there's a discussion in Slack where somebody was like, yeah, could you like put description fields on this? I was like, oh yeah, we should totally do that. And that's like no code, right? We just add that field and then let users have at it. And I think that would get us like 80% of the way. And I think another 10% of the way would be to just tell users that it's an anti-pattern to consume individual fields of complex data. That if you ask for source one, and source one is meant to be some complex struct, that you are going to drop that entire complex struct into some field. And if you are not going to do that, if you're going to attempt to parse it and like use one value of that struct in one place and one value of that struct in another place, it's like, no, make those two different parameters.
I think it depends.
Yeah,
there's
like the case
some
of
cases that works
pod
really well, in
intent,
other
right?
cases, or like environment variables. Like you can't just plop in an array of envars and it's like merge them together for some definition of what merge together means.
Yeah.
Or the case of pod intent where we're promoting the whole like pod template spec, right? Like you need the whole struct to be passed along. You can't really break it into discrete fields. Like you could in a terrible way, naming the fields as how you would access in the JSON, but like that'd be tough.
But when we have the pod intent, do we take that whole pod intent and step the whole thing into a template in one place, or do we parse it to consume different pieces of it in different places?
No, so in the pod intent, in the status, there's a field called template, and that is a pod template spec. We essentially make that as the target of config path. So we have like cluster config template, config path, .status, .template. And so as a result, we're promoting that whole struct forward to whoever takes it. And then whoever takes it does something with it. Like I think it's ESYTT, YAML, you put it in the right place. I don't remember exactly, but whoever consumes it, it's getting that whole pod templates back as a struct.
So they might just consume the whole thing and just plop it in as a single value. It could also be that they are aware of the structure of that value and then doing something more meaningful with it.
So,
which is why it's important to have schema attached to these outputs. Because config is just like hey, here's whatever, have fun.
Yeah.
Oh,
I guess this gets to a question of like organization.
It's certainly more specialized.
Well, both specialized, but also it assumes that you have these two teams that are doing these complicated things, and they have like minimal communication between them. Because what I would say is, like my first dictate is to the consuming side, where I say if you ask for the struct, don't like consume the whole struct, never consume part of the struct. And then there's like the knock on, well, if you just want to consume part of the struct, like talk to the person who's producing that and tell them, give me access to part of the struct separately. Okay, I want you to write a template that gives me just that part that I need and not like the whole thing. Like don't make me parse this thing.
No,
and so
there might be two different consumers of the same output resource. And if I had to produce the same output twice, that would feel a little bit silly. I mean, maybe it makes sense, and maybe that's the correct thing to do if you actually have two truly distinct uses. But then it requires that my need on the consuming side is enforcing a change on the producing side.
Yes,
Eh,
I agree.
And in the
That's the
consuming side,
implication.
with YTT, we can do effectively what schemas would give us, right? Because you can essentially do assertions, you can do all of those checks with YTT. So theoretically, yes, like as a consumer, you can protect yourself against the bad inputs coming in, which is what I was going to say about description. Yeah, I agree that, yeah, we could start with description. That would absolutely help a lot, especially in terms of UI or like a CLI that like guides you through something. Super useful. Ultimately, I think that having in the param itself, the schema is very, very powerful to give you that experience. Like, you're coding in Rust, at build time, what goes wrong, and you know exactly where you messed up something. I think that's like a very powerful thing. In the case of Cartographer, it wouldn't really be like a compile time error if we make that as the equivalent of a webhook telling you what's wrong, because we have to follow references, right? But still, it feels like an early enough kind of warning that we could now have that I feel like could be very, very powerful.
It's still better to have the workload reconciler fail than to stamp out a resource and then have that resource be ambiguous.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to get at. Yeah.
We are
Fair enough. We're way over.
over.
We've been losing
I think this is a
folks.
good conversation, so I'm willing to keep going, but I think everyone else has dropped.
Yeah. And I'm sorry to say that I got a delivery in the last few minutes, so I missed the very important notes.
No, I'm more thankful for the notes that exist than than I am frustrated about any that don't. Yeah, I guess the one thing. So as you can see, I have a couple more that I want to write. Can provide params in the selector, shape to own, description field to params, allow typing of params, inputs, etc. So 5 more RFCs. But I think that one thing that would be super useful is to have some way to discuss what are the most important changes and which are the easiest changes, so that we can, oh yeah, a 2x2. Okay, we should just have a meeting
I can say right now
in the future where we have a 2x2.
easiest one is adding description to params.
Yeah.
That one's for sure.
So yeah, I'll keep writing it, and then it sounds like we should have a meeting where we do a 2x2. Maybe we schedule I think it'll probably take me until next Monday to have finished these up, and then I wouldn't be surprised if it takes the meeting to describe them, and then maybe we want to have another meeting that we schedule for that 2x2, or we just ask people to block out a super long block to discuss next week.
How should I describe the 2x2 in the notes?
What's the?
Or sorry, like the 2x2 to cover what topics? Because those are 5 different points that I'm trying to like glom together.
The 2x2 is a ease of implementation versus value to customers. Then we try to figure out and we use that to prioritize, like what are we going to do first, and then what are we going to do later, and then what aren't we going to do?
Okay. So the 2x2 is going to cover like all these points, not just the last 5 that we're still fleshing out.
Yeah, it would be like, okay, we've got all these RFCs, like which ones are we going to start attacking?
So one thing I think is worth also putting a little thought into for everyone is what do we want to do with blueprints that's not covered by these items? And like really would necessitate moving to a new resource? I think most of these items are framed in the context of we can layer on these capabilities onto the existing resources. Like, is there anything that we're missing from the desired for blueprints that aren't covered?
I'd say the one is I'm planning to write this up as any Kate's object that has as I say, a certain shape. It has to have a service account field in its spec, and it has to have a status that has all the fields that we write to when we stamp out an object. And given that, we will successfully reconcile with it. And if we wanted to make this, if we wanted to make it even more general and just say, you know, oh, you could use a config map to as the origin for your blueprint, like that's a huge breaking change where you have to have some third object. You have to figure out a new way to specify the service account that would be used.
I mean, that's what the blueprint selector does, which that's already a net new resource. So like there's room there to do something new.
The blueprint selector could provide the service account, you're saying?
Yeah.
Could specify it?
It
That is a fair
also-
point.
It can also specify how to map status.
It could specify how to map the status, but current tooling built on top of Cartographer wouldn't be able to consume that. It would be a big breaking change.
Well,
for the
it would be a
UI.
different resource. So like those other tools are like coupled to the specific resources that exist, like workload.
Mhm.
So if we said that Cartographer can now reconcile config map, and that idea partially scares me, but like let's just go with it. Then like those other tools would have to know to go read and interact with config map and how to interact with config map. So like that's like, yes, that is not something existing tools will understand, but I wouldn't expect them to. Like that's net new behavior.
Yeah. So for me, that's the thing that I would call out as like, that would be a thing where I'd be like, let's just go with blueprints. Let's just make clear that there's like something completely different. Their thoughts? I don't know if otherwise, I think everything else can be achieved within the current supply chains. It sounds like you're saying like even this, you think of it as something we can achieve within current supply chains.
I mean, just because the current behavior, like all the new behavior is defined in a new resource, whatever that name is. It's basically the idea of we remove the selector or you make the selector optional on cluster supply chain. And then create the new resource that allows it to be reconciled. And then that actually takes responsibility for the mapping into the supply chain. But in this case, it can also handle the mappings back out on the case of status.
So I think in answer to your question, the answer is there's no change that would require us to move to a new CRD. Like 3, 2, 1. Thanks for your time. Yeah, definitely feel free to drop in. Feel free to drop in notes to this, and I'll be responsive to those. I know that I added this. I don't think I took any other notes about changes that need to be made. So if you heard me promise like, oh, I'm going to make some change, feel free to ping me in the next 20 minutes and be like, remember you said that you were going to do this. Otherwise, I will see you guys at least next week.